This is Jose Merino, Editor-in-Chief of the Neurology family of journals. The Neurology podcast provides practical information to neurologists and other clinicians to help them provide better care for their patients. Thanks for listening and have a great week.
Hello, my name is Gordon Smith. I'm a neuromuscular neurologist and chair of the Department of Neurology at VCU. I'm really excited today to have the opportunity to talk with Hoda Abdel-Hamid, who is an associate professor of neurology at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, where she serves as the director of the Muscular Dystrophy Association Clinic at the Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh. Hoda has kindly agreed to join me today on the Neurology podcast to discuss the recent, very exciting FDA approval of the first ever gene therapy for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which is an AAV-based microdystrophin therapy with the trade name ELEVIDYS. Hoda, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you for inviting me.
I wonder if you can begin by telling us, why is this such a big deal? What's the bottom line? How well does it work? And how you see this FDA approval changing the field?
So, as you said, it's very exciting news because it's the first gene therapy that is approved for a fatal and common genetic disease that affects boys, which is Duchenne muscular dystrophy. We've known about Duchenne muscular dystrophy since the 1800s. It's named after Dr. Duchenne, who was a French doctor. And there's been, in the past probably 10 years, very exciting clinical trials that have aimed towards finding treatment options for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So we know it's a genetic disease, so gene therapy would be an ideal answer to treat this genetic disease. And hence, it's very exciting news that gene therapy is now available and it's FDA approved. Of course, there are challenges still, even though after the gene therapy is approved and it's gone through clinical trials for many years now. And the reason it's exciting because, this offers hope for many patients with a potentially fatal disease and that affects, every muscle in the body. And the fact that it has gone through FDA approval as the first gene therapy for Duchenne, again, it's very exciting.
Hoda, maybe you can tell us a little more about the treatment itself, right? So ELEVIDYS, it's an adenoviral-based gene therapy that inserts the microdystrophin gene or a microdystrophin gene into muscles. What's microdystrophin? How does this work for patients?
So it's manufactured edited gene. So microdystrophin, because it's much smaller than the actual gene for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. We know it's one of the largest genes in the human genome, which is about 79 exons. And then to be able to incorporate this large gene in the natural phase would be very difficult. And that's why it was shortened, edited. So basically it was reconstructed to be able to be incorporated inside a shell, which in this case is an AAV virus, which is the AAVrh74. And the editing was, of course, based on clinical trials, but also clinical data based on a patient with Becker's muscular dystrophy that was found to have a very mild disease, even though he in his 60s. So the area of the gene that was edited was supposed to mimic the same phenotype as this patient. So that's why it's called a micro or mini dystrophin. They're actually interchangeable and includes important parts of the gene that can actually carry the genetic information that is important to form or to produce the dystrophin protein, or a protein that's very similar or mimicking the natural dystrophin protein. And hopefully they can also provide the same function.
Say partial replacement, right? The entire dystrophin gene is just too large, so we're inserting a smaller dystrophin gene. What's the clinical benefit? Are we turning a Duchenne phenotype into a Becker phenotype? What are we hoping to see in clinical care in terms of impact?
I think that is definitely the hope here, that to turn a potentially fatal disease or a severely progressive disease, which is Duchenne muscular dystrophy, into a milder form, which is Becker's muscular dystrophy. Since the gene itself, that is the microdystrophin gene that is incorporated into the shell, is a little bit different from the normal dystrophin gene. So here we're hoping to produce enough dystrophin to be able to sustain the muscle fibers and prevent the continuous progression or destruction of the muscle fibers, which help improve the overall function of the muscle and improve the integrity of the muscle membrane and prevent the overall progression of the disease.
What are the risks? I know that there were a couple of holds placed during clinical development of the agent. Safety was definitely a source of discussion at the May FDA Advisory Committee meeting. What do we know about risks and side effects?
So we know the risk could be related to the actual shell where the harbors the mini dystrophin, which is made of the shell for the AAVrh74, which is the adenovirus. So we know that adenovirus exists in nature and we can be readily exposed to it, but you can develop antibodies to the actual shell. Adenoviruses, there's tons of adenovirus infections yearly. In general, it's well tolerated, but if it's a larger amount, as we will be injecting in a patient, I think the concern mainly is the burden of the actual viral shell on the body of the patient. And in this case, they're young children. We know that the AAVrh74 shell actually is processed through the liver. So there is concerns about the liver damage or elevated liver enzymes and potentially, liver failure. So definitely this is a big concern, which is most likely related to an immune response in this case. So there could be an intensive immune response that could pose a effect on the body of the children that receive this gene therapy. The other concern is there were some side effects related to the gene transfer or the gene therapy itself. And I believe that the actual cause for it is not very well known, but one of the potential side effects could be the development of myositis, which is inflammation of the muscles that has been reported in some patients. Also inflammation of the cardiac muscles, which is myocarditis. So that can potentially be detrimental. And that those were some of the reports. It is thought that this could be related to certain mutations, maybe that have more tendency to develop these, but it's not very well known. So I think this should be always considered and discussed with families if this is going to be a treatment option that the families would pursue, that this is a potential side effect to this treatment.
Great segue to the next question I wanted to ask, Hoda, which has to do with the controversy regarding this approval. Clearly very exciting and a real milestone in Duchenne therapy, but there was a fair bit of controversy at the FDA Advisory Committee meeting. As I recall, the advisory vote to approve was like 8-6, right? And there were a significant minority of folks who openly disagreed, in part because of the risks. I wonder if you can talk us through that controversy and give us a sense to which this controversy is still something that's going on within the Duchenne community.
So I can tell you that probably from a parent's point of view, that it's not really a controversy. There are actually a lot of parents and families are actually waiting for this treatment for many years. From the physician's aspect, I think it's also a breakthrough treatment. I cannot totally speak to why there was a huge controversy in the FDA panel. However, I can possibly speculate that there was concerns regarding the earlier results for the study, which didn't show a significant difference between some cohorts. However, apparently this was related to how they divided the cohorts, and that maybe some of the patients who were included in the earlier study were older, maybe had a more advanced disease, and maybe that's why it didn't show a huge improvement or at least significant improvement in some of the functional assessments, like the North Star assessment. So it's possible that the controversy was related to that. The other controversy that could probably, again, I'm speculating here, that it is not a cure, but it's actually a significant treatment for patients with a progressive disease. And in this case, turning a Duchenne into a Becker. As you may know, there are other treatment options available now that are FDA approved that could potentially turn a Duchenne into a Becker. However, they are lifelong weekly infusions, so they're not ideal. There was a big difference in responses between patients. So it's possible that's why there was a controversy, because there are maybe other options. And the also potential for side effects could have been also a deterrent for the approval. The other concern could be also that there are limitations in some of genetic mutations, since some mutations were actually excluded eventually from the treatment trial because of the concern regarding possible development of these potential side effects. So I think that it still is exciting because it's a gene therapy treatment for a progressive disease, and that it offers hope for many patients and larger scale compared to other treatment options that are currently available for Duchenne. I'm hoping that there will be other modifications, probably treatment trials that can maybe even expand the availability of this treatment for other patients with different mutations, and also maybe ways to circumvent some of the side effects that have been associated with it.
The FDA restriction of access to those 4 to 5 years of age who could still walk, was that the population that seemed to have the most benefit in the study?
That's what it seems from the trial eventually, that of course the younger patients and also the milder phenotype or affected patients did seem to show the most benefit. We know that, again, Duchenne is a genetic disease, so the babies are born with it, and we know that the muscle destruction starts very early. So it makes a lot of sense that it's ideal treatment for the younger population. However, I was also a little bit surprised because the treatment trial included patients up to 8 years at least. So I would have thought that maybe the FDA would expand it at least to that age group. And there were smaller trials with smaller cohorts with even older patients, which the FDA did say that they may look at these trials later on and may expand the access to other patients. But however, I think in general, the earlier, for any genetic disease, the earlier treatment, the better. And in this case, it did show that in some of the treatment trials.
So I think many listeners may be aware ELEVIDYS was approved using the FDA's accelerated approval pathway. In fact, I think it's the first gene therapy ever approved through an accelerated approval pathway. And as we've learned with other recent high-profile new drug approvals, that pathway is really based on demonstration of effective biomarkers. So in here, microdystrophin expression. And so we've talked about this idea of converting a Duchenne phenotype to a Becker phenotype. Can you tell us, do we have data suggesting that? One of the things that I think we've all seen and been really wowed by are these videos of kids who've been treated who are walking, running, biking, climbing stairs, stuff like this. Pretty amazing. Do those videos in and of themselves provide evidence of clinical benefit, or are we still really waiting for good data regarding ultimate clinical benefit to follow what is a very promising biological benefit?
So I think the videos are exciting and very good news to many of the parents and, of course, clinicians. However, we have to be careful because of the impact of some social media. And I think the way to look at this is to focus on the actual results of the trial. So looking at the microdystrophin, I think that was one of the biomarkers that were looked at. And in this case, it seems like this was one of the appropriate biomarkers to look at because we want to make sure that the microdystrophin gene transfer actually produces microdystrophin and that it encircles a muscle fiber, that it's supposed where it's localized. In addition to the secondary endpoints, which they looked at the functional assessments, which together with the presence of microdystrophin, they both actually validate the results and that the effect of the microdystrophin gene, that it actually not just that its presence, but it actually produces some functional gain, which in this case also is confirmed through the videos. However, we don't know when these videos were taken, and I think we just have to be careful how we look at whether it's social media or other presentations that we can be faced with. The one thing that also was looked at is actually the CPK level. Even though it's not a great biomarker, however, in this case, and especially Duchenne muscular dystrophy, we know that one of the first screening labs that we look at is the high CPK. And we know that high CK in Duchenne is remarkable. It's sometimes over 10,000. So in this case, they actually looked at how it lowers CK, which I think in my mind, this actually is a great marker about the integrity of the muscle fiber membrane. And it seemed like it actually helped through the trial. So this was another biomarker that was looked at. So I believe that actually it was appropriate to look at the microdystrophin in addition to the functional assessment in this case. And it's nice to look at the videos. And of course, it's reassuring for families, but we have to focus on the actual clinical trial results.
It's The next question has to do with the idea that you only get one shot at this, no pun intended. That is that once a patient has received an adenoviral-based gene therapy, they can't go back and have another dose or even another AAV-based therapy. Is that true? And what implications does that have? For instance, I mean, you would expect this is going to be a partial win, right? Hoping to see this sort of Duchenne to Becker effect. But does this have implications for patients who maybe have milder disease where you're hoping for a future gene therapy that's more of a home run? How do we think about this?
I think we should look at it as if a family decides that this is what they would like to pursue, I think we definitely have to be discussing about how serious this is a decision. Now, we know that Duchenne, again, is a serious disease. And so to look at the treatment options here, I think we have to still put into consideration all the potential side effects and that some of them can be, potentially fatal. So I think the fact that, again, this is AAV-related viral transfer gene therapy should be looked at with caution, that we definitely need to follow through with all the recommendations about, the use of steroids prior to the transfer, how to wean off the steroids eventually, how to monitor the patient very closely, and to have a team of subspecialists that may be needed in case of side effects that could develop. It is possibly a one-shot deal. However, there are talks in the neuromuscular community about whether or not a patient can have a transfer again many years down the road with using, immunotherapy or maybe immune suppression. However, this is not available now, and this should not be even considered now because we don't know about it. And I think it may come down the road. There may be other treatment options that come out that do not include an adenovirus or a viral shell. So I think for now, this is what we have, and it still should be taking, with considerations about the potential side effects. But again, we're running against time in patients with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, even in milder cases, since, we know that this is a progressive disease and sometimes it can start as a milder form, but you don't know when the patient will actually continue to progress or have a more rapid progression. And sometimes there is a discrepancy between patients, even within same families. And it is a heterogeneous disease, even though it falls under one name, which is Duchenne muscular dystrophy. But we do see quite a bit of a difference between patients, even with same mutations, and occasionally within same family members. So I think it's a consideration. It may not be a light decision. However, considering every patient, it should be also discussed case by case and to discuss the potential side effects for this treatment, and that the monitoring will have to occur very closely, and that there may be something else down the road that doesn't include a viral vector that may be offered if this is not an ideal treatment for certain patients.
One last question for you. This isn't an easy one, but I'm curious what your thoughts are about the price. Sarepta's announced a price of $3.5 million, and I know that they're in discussions with payers regarding innovative contracting, which is interesting to hear. What are your thoughts about that? Do you think it's justified by the clinical effect, or is it, put differently, an appropriate value-based price?
Gordon, I think that as doctors, a lot of times we don't know what's the price for medications, but in this case, we have to know. And it is pricey, but again, it's technology, I think, and the clinical trials and the fact that this is a treatment that could change the overall lifespan and also the quality of life and minimize the amount of morbidity for certain patients. It's very difficult for me as a physician to justify how much some of the medications we offer patients are priced. And I kind of wish that there was some regulatory entity that can actually discuss how much pricing are on some of these medications. In this case, it's gene therapy. And of course, the amount of money that gets put into the treatment trials, the amount of money that gets put into manufacturing may justify this price. However, it will be a burden in the health system at some level. And I think this is a bigger discussion that may need to occur.
We certainly have a voice to play, as do patients. And for listeners who are interested, I know the Neurology podcast has done a number of interviews with Steve Pearson, who's the now outgoing president of the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, including one that I did with him around the time of the Zolgensma approval about rare disease drug pricing. So those of our listeners who are interested, those might make some insight into this very complicated question. Hoda, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. This has been a really great conversation. You've taught me a lot, and I think it's such an exciting time in our field and certainly in neuromuscular medicine. I really want to thank you for sharing your insights.
Thank you.
This is Stacey Clardy, your podcast editor. Thank you for listening and for letting us join you on your commute, while you're exercising, or even while you're brushing your teeth. This has been another episode of the Neurology Podcast, your best source of practical, relevant, and timely information for neurologists, clinicians, and patients.